The first thing you have to decide is that you're going to make a film, and then there's just a lot of very hard work to collect materials, to organize that material, and then to decide on the story, because ultimately you're telling a story. The truth is a very elusive thing, and you try to get to it with a story. And I don't know that the average person that doesn't make films is as clear about that. So we've got 10 episodes, 18 hours. How many hours of material over the 10 years that you worked on this did you collect to ultimately end up with 18 hours?
Go ahead, yeah. Well, I'm sure over the course of the evening we'll talk a lot about what our process is like and what happens over the 10 years, but just in terms of the archival material and how much material we bring into our, first our production office and then to our editing room, I think it's, for a film of this scale, sort of staggering. We have, our researchers and producers, and Ken, Lynn, and Jeff and I look at literally tens of thousands of photographs, thousands of hours of newsreel footage, thousands of pieces of music, and we shoot, there are 80 interviews in the film. We shot 100 interviews. Each one of those interviews is a couple of hours long. And then we had our cameras shooting our own live cinematography. So for a couple of years on the project, we're actually a very quiet little library where everybody is logging time code, and it's very fastidious, very quiet. I think people don't expect that, but yeah, we bring in a ton of material.
So, and you were one of the producers on the film. What's the main job of a producer? And what was your specific job as a producer?
Well, I produced the film with Ken and Lynn, and at every stage of the project, my job changes. So I don't have really one job description. I have about 100. I like to say that my job is really to worry. I just sort of worry about everything.
Worry and remove obstacles.
Yes. We do research, we plan production trips, we do licensing, we make sure that our staff is as happy as can be, that we're as good a team as we can be, and that what Ken and Lynn are trying to do shows up on screen.
So, Lynn, you and Ken were the ones that had to craft this story. How did you, from the truth, and how did you start as you were conceptualizing what the documentary was going to be? And then how did that shift as you started this 2-year examination of material and then the interviews and all of those kind of things?
Yeah, it's a little hard to explain that we started off really with a very simple idea, which was we were going to try to tackle the Vietnam War and tell it from the perspective of people who lived through it and not have people who didn't live through it on screen, historians and so-called experts, that the experts would be the people who could tell you what they experienced. And that we were very committed to representing Vietnamese perspectives, because so often when Americans talk about the Vietnam War, we're talking about ourselves, and that only gives you really a third of the story at best. There's 3 sides. So that was our concept. But
so first-person narratives.
First-person narratives.
With a very rounded view of what happened.
Right, multidimensional. But that's an idea. How you actually make that real is, somewhat terrifying, because, where do you start? And we just have, over the many years I've worked with Ken and Sarah's worked with us, we sort of trust our process, we trust our instincts, we trust our advisors. We bring together a panel of extremely qualified and diverse advisors. But then it's a lot of sort of shoe leather, going out in the world, talking to people, listening, trying to understand, first thing we had to learn, there's no one truth about this war. So we weren't actually looking for the truth. We were trying to understand many truths. And, what we found was even more complicated than we could have imagined. So it becomes iterative. You meet someone, you talk to them, maybe you read a book, then you meet 3 other people, you talk to them, and then you read another book, and then you find some website online, or you look at some newsreel, and you begin to understand the dimensions of the story. So we didn't know we were going to have 80 people in the film. We didn't know we were going to have 30 Vietnamese witnesses. We didn't know we were going to find a 4-star general who was a fighter pilot on the Ho Chi Minh Trail and tell his story in combination with a Vietnamese couple who worked on the Ho Chi Minh Trail being bombed by him. You know, we couldn't have written these things, or we didn't know what we were looking for. We just were looking for really interesting, thoughtful people. You met many of them today who were willing to tell their stories. And once we collected a lot of these testimonies, then our writer, Jeff Ward, started to write our script. And then we started to build archival libraries, and then we started to edit. So it's a many-year process, and it keeps changing, like Sarah's saying.
And I think, just to add 2 things to what Lynn
Yeah.
said, that once we have these central characters and we know we're going to march through the history chronologically and Jeff is writing, then we take all of that material and we start researching. We research till the very last day when we finally just put our pens down and say this is done. So we start with a very blank slate and we finally just walk away. People often ask us how we know when we're finished, and I think we sort of think we're finished and we finally just have to walk away. But that for everybody who worked on the project, bringing the stories to life of the people who were courageous and generous enough to tell their stories was such a responsibility and such a privilege that actually that animates and energizes us more than anything we do.
And one of the more terrifying things is to have someone who was there watch the film, and hopefully they think it more or less approximates what they remember, and usually they do, thank goodness.
And you screened this film as you went along to folks that were deeply involved with the war in terms of being soldiers in the war, being leaders of the war on both sides, and being protesters of the war, and politicians involved. How did their feedback work through you and with you as you put this together?
Well, Lynn and I probably both want to speak about this. I think film, and particularly documentary film, and even more particularly historic documentary films that we make, are tremendously collaborative, and we work very, very closely with our board of advisors, as Lynn mentioned earlier. So from the very first scripting phase to the final mastered picture and sound lock, we really don't leave home without them. We want them to tell us what feels right, what feels wrong, what we're missing, and they, for this film, have a wide range of perspectives and come at the subject from very different points of view, and that was enormously helpful and a great privilege. And so that's a very exciting part of what we do.
I mean, the only thing I will add is that some of our advisors were people who lived through it or were not professional experts in the subject, and some of them are both. And then we also would bring into screenings some of the witnesses who were there, some of their families, and sort of extended family in the larger sense of just people who'd be interested to watch the film and tell us what they think. And we had some of the most interesting conversations of our careers after these screenings, because everyone who came to screenings, no matter who they were, no matter what their experience of the war, felt they learned things they didn't know. And that was the sort of aha moment after aha moment. I didn't know that. And then it sort of provoked very interesting conversations across all kinds of divides in our edit room about what we had seen, and sort of fine-tuning the film so that it, left room for that conversation to happen is what we worked on really hard, among many things.
So we're going to have a dialogue here for just a few minutes, and then we're going to get to audience questions. But let's continue here for just a moment. As you, what were the most transformative dynamics in your thinking that changed as you got into this process? As you encountered the interviewers, as you discovered the stories, as the poignant elements worked on your mind and your soul?
That's exactly what happened, what you just said, in ways we could never have expected. And I think it's very hard to find words, really, to put around the kind of experiences that we had doing the interviews for this film, because it's an epic tragedy on an enormous scale. And but then each person's experience can be whatever they are. how can I explain this? It's, there's something very transcendent that happens when someone actually sits down and decides, I'm going to just really tell you what I feel, what I felt, who I am, in a deep way, sometimes in ways that they don't tell to their people that are closest to them for all kinds of reasons. And so we're not strangers. We spend time with people, get to know them, but still, we don't know them all that well. And the camera goes on, and you start a conversation, and things come out, and something almost transcendent happens of this sort of transferring of this experience to us, and then we get to transfer it to you on the screen. And I think what we came away with was a sense of the power of narrative that people, the sort of what you heard at the beginning of Max Cleland saying we have to find meaning in suffering, and people do. We do. And that is a gift that I think I certainly have taken away from the project, is meeting many people who have really gone through enormous pain and suffering and loss, and here they are, and they're telling you their story, and they're living and breathing, and they're, present, and that's a great lesson that I will never forget.
No, I think what Lynn said is very apt, and I think the only thing I would add, and we all have talked a lot about this, and some of the people who we interviewed really shed light on this for us, that for most of the people that we interviewed, this is sort of coming of age moment in their lives, which I think for all of us is a very heightened, very bright, it's easy to go back to that time in your life when you come of age. And so whether you were in the anti-war movement from the very beginning, or came home as a soldier and joined Vietnam Veterans Against the War, or served in the military, or were the sister of someone who fought, wherever you're coming from that now in your 60s, or however old you are looking back, those are very visceral, quick things to go back to. And that comes across for us too.
So the North Vietnamese or Viet Cong soldier, the North Vietnamese soldier, that was that said that people who weren't involved with the war talk about winning and losing. If you were in the war, all you could think about was destruction, that's what war brings. We think of World War II as the good war, and I give that context that even the good war is mostly just destruction. But in this particular case, because it was such a polarizing political dynamic, it seems that the story is so very complex, because you're not talking about X's and O's on a battlefield and an enemy that in history seems to be something that was just evil, as in World War II, even though the people who fought the war may not have been that way. But in this particular case, there's such a complex resonance with society of the time, of the political machinations of a country that was learning how to be a world leader in the United States after it had provided a major value in the World War II era. How that is such a complex story. How did you organize, or how did your thinking change about that as you confronted the people and the material and those transcendent stories?
Okay, well.
In 1 minute.
Yeah, right, okay. Yeah. I think, it's an impossible question to answer in some ways, right? So, because
and you started off that way.
Right.
Clearly, you weren't looking to track how the arc of history swelled to defeat the evil forces. It was like, oh my God, where are the evil forces? What strategic decisions were made? What governmental dynamics were enforced?
Right.
I mean, you started off that way.
I think we really just tried to put, kind of unpack this history back to the beginning and put the pieces back in order so we could actually understand the reasons why we were there shifted over time. The country shifted, things changed, and so you have to really see it unfold over time. And so the rationale in 1955 and 1960, 1965, 1970 are different. and the public's relationship to the story to what was happening is different. But I think, the one thing that we can certainly all say is that it was extremely painful for our country to go through a situation where a war became, over time, increasingly unpopular and more difficult to explain to the public why we were there, why people were dying, what was happening, and our patience did run out after a while, which our leaders knew would eventually happen in a democracy. And so our soldiers came back to a country that didn't really fully embrace what they had done and what we were doing and what our leaders had asked us to do and what had happened in the war. And so it was, extremely traumatic, and we just didn't deal with it. And we didn't thank our soldiers for their service, and we didn't welcome them home in the way that we should have. And there's a lot of unfinished business on that front, which brings me to the point that if there are any Vietnam veterans here tonight, we would like you to stand so we can actually thank you, if that's possible. Yeah. Thank you.
Your work has been displayed on PBS, the public broadcasting system. Why PBS? There's, especially these days, there's so many different outlets for documentary films, but you have that commitment. What is the virtue of PBS that makes you stick with it the way that you have?
Well, I think speak for Ken first and foremost and say that he always says his only home is public television. It is the only home he's ever had, and he so deeply and truly believes in the mission of public television, the mission of public media, that we could not make the kinds of films that we make and do the work that we do really anywhere else on the dial. And I think we are, from him all the way down, everybody who works on these projects feels that way. And in the last few years, as we've gotten ready to talk about this film, and our country has changed, and this question has risen. I mean, it comes up every few years anyway, but it's really at the forefront of a discussion in our country right now. It feels even more important that we have public media and public television and public radio. And so we're very, very proud and hope to work in this with PBS for a very long time.
That's great. And God bless PBS.
Just to add one thing, I think, our films don't just exist on television, and we do a lot for education, and we do a lot in the communities, and we travel around the country, and we are committed to the community aspect of public television, and there's nothing else like that in the country except our public libraries.
Right. That there is that public thing in public television, and it
there
makes
really
a,
is,
a
and it
big
makes a big difference.
Well, why don't we start, folks coming up? There's 2 microphones right here at the front, and come on up. There's a volunteer there that will help you and help organize those questions, and we'll just go from one side to the next as people have. And we suggest we ask you urgently that you ask a question as opposed to make a long statement. Thank you.
Yeah, I have a short factual issue, and then I have a question. The factual issue is the contention, which I think I heard in the film, you haven't spoken to it, that the Vietnam War was more or less forgotten and ignored for years afterwards. And that's not my recollection, and in particular, since we're talking about PBS, in 1983, there was a 13-part series, which, as my recollection, I looked it up just before I came up, was the most viewed series on public television prior to the showing of the Civil War by Mr. Burns. So I don't think that it's actually, I think my recollection... Let's
get to your question.
My question is whether in your, because obviously this was just excerpts, I was a participant in the anti-war part of this, as I suspect many people here were, and I recall that there was always an extremely intense effort to try to reach soldiers, to get soldiers involved. And one of the most nefarious myths of the last few decades is that the anti-war movement was hostile to the troops, because it was not. It was pro-troop. And I hope that that's going to be taken up in some way in your program.
Again, we would appreciate, we appreciate everyone's perspective on this. This is a Q&A, so if you can frame your statement as a question like they do in Jeopardy.
I think I will just say thank you for your comments, and you know, the story of how the American public responded to what was happening in Vietnam is extremely important in our film, and the role of people who protested the war and tried to make it stop and end it is a hugely important story that we tell. And it evolves over time from a small, relatively small scale thing to something that you saw epically large and has a huge effect on the country and on the course of the war. And we have many people in the film talking about why they did what they did and their feelings about the war. So I think you have to watch the whole film, and you will see that we have tried to raise the really important question of what does it mean to be a patriot of a country, and what do you do when your country is doing something you don't think is in its best interest, and are you meant to loyally obey whatever orders come your way, or question and protest and try to make things change and be different? And those are hugely important questions that are central to the film.
Yeah, I've seen a different set of excerpts other than this, and that part, again, I haven't seen the whole thing, but it does seem to be very well treated. And if I'm not mistaken, I think Ken Burns was at that teach-in in Ann Arbor.
His father was.
helped organize it.
His father was in the anthropology department there, yeah.
As filmmakers, did you reach out to interview whatever military or government officials are still surviving to get their perspective on what happened during the war?
I'm sorry, to military what?
Well, you know, there were military leaders, there were government officials, obviously the presidents are all deceased, but did you reach out to any officials with the government or the military to get their take on what happened over there?
Thank you.
We made the decision very early on not to interview the more famous people that you might think of when you think of the Vietnam War: John Kerry, John McCain.
Robert McNamara.
Right, he wasn't alive, but we really wanted those people appear archivally in the film as they were then, but not commenting looking back. We really wanted, I think, because this is history where people feel very strongly about it one way or another, we wanted it to be mostly a cast of characters that most Americans have never heard of, so that they just can go on a journey with that person, not quite knowing where they might be, what point of view they might be coming at it from. So,
And you know, there really aren't too many people who were above the colonel level in the military that are still, who were above a level of colonel during the Vietnam War, who are still alive. We interviewed people who rose to higher levels subsequently.
and who worked in the government but weren't in this more senior positions then.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
I can tell the music is very, very powerful even in these excerpts, and I was wondering, could you explain or talk about how you get the music of Bob Dylan or Louis Armstrong, and, you know, without going into detail, but, you know, how forthcoming are those sources for music?
And the Beatles.
Well, that was really one of the most challenging, most rewarding, and most fun things that we did on this project. I think, speak for everybody. Before we started editing, when we were really at the very beginning stages, we knew that we were dealing with a time in our history that has arguably our best rock and roll. These are anthems of a generation that our children still listen to. And typically it would cost $1 million to put one song, and we were looking at needing over 100. So we had the great privilege of taking our time and working with artists, their record companies, their publishers, their managers, their estates, their heirs, and saying that we really wanted to put their music into its historic context, to highlight how music and culture changed over the course of the war. And to an artist and to a person, they all really wanted to be included. So we have the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Bob Dylan, Jimi Hendrix, Nina Simone, Sam Cooke, you name it. They really
Doors?
we don't have the Doors. And that's more an editing choice than a practical choice. But, and, you know, when you hear a piece of music, if it's 1968, we're not playing a piece of music that came out in 1972. And we wanted to play the music actually when it would have been heard by the people in the film. So, yeah, it was a great part of the project.
We asked a lot of the people we interviewed, what were you listening to? So we started our
Everybody.
playlist. Yeah,
we
with
we
what
made
did
them
they
all
like?
give us a list.
Yes, sir.
Yes, thanks. That hour or so was just fantastic. I want to thank you both. And some of the parts in there were so resonating. You showed the Vietnam veteran, the war veteran wall, and you also mentioned that a lot of the veterans don't talk about the war. My question to you both is, do you feel in your career right now that you're at the top of your game and that, you know, it looks like it's just going to be fabulous, you know, the storytelling and, you know, I was sitting there saying to myself, yes, you know, that resonates with me, and yes, you know, when I took my daughter to the Vietnam Wall and I started crying and she said, Dad, why are you crying? And I said, Ellen, you wouldn't understand, you know, and that really resonated. Do you guys feel this is the best work you've ever done?
Well, I will say it was the hardest thing we've ever done. I don't think it's for us to say if it's the best thing we've ever done. We really put our all into it. I think everyone working on this project just sort of, and really, you know, Ken and Sarah and Jeff and I will be sort of the people who get a lot of credit for what you see on screen, but actually our editors and our researchers and our producers and our sound editors and our mixer, and there's so many people that really, every day I think we felt went above and beyond what we could have imagined, and just we were given so many gifts by all the people who contributed to the film, and I think it's because of the importance of the story. We felt, you know, that we've been given an opportunity to tell this really tough story, and this opportunity won't come around again. I don't think it'll be a generation before somebody else takes this on, and the people will be too old to tell their stories, and so it's kind of like we have this moment, and we really want to make the best of it, and so I don't know, we raised the bar for ourselves, and then everyone on our team just went above and beyond it.
And I think, as Lynn said, not for us to judge whether it's our best work or if we're at the top of our game, but Ken always likes to quote this, and we had, when we made our jazz series, that Duke Ellington used to say his best work is the one he's working on now or the one coming out tomorrow. So we're going to stick with that and keep working together.
It was tremendous. Thanks.
Thank you.
We're going to have 2 more questions. We have a screening right after this, unfortunately, because we could keep going for hours. But yes.
Thank you for this documentary. It was very, very touching. My question is, in the documentary, will you be showing any influence that John F. Kennedy and Johnson had, what parts they played in the beginnings of the war?
Oh, yeah, so, I mean, maybe I should have explained. This film is told chronologically, and we start in 1858 when the French invade and take over Indochina, and we come up to today, and the politics and the presidential leadership or lack thereof or challenges are a huge part of the story. So I think you saw Johnson in one of the clips yelling at a reporter, right, that he wasn't happy with the coverage, but the presidents are hugely important, as are the leaders in Saigon and Hanoi. So you get to know them pretty well. And I think that one of the devastating things that we've sort of come to understand was that there never really was a time since America got involved in Vietnam that our leaders were confident that we could win this war. And most of the time they thought we probably couldn't. And yet they kept on fighting it.
I know you're going through an explanation over the 18 hours, but why didn't we learn from the French? Why did we make the same mistake they made?
Well, if we had President Kennedy here, maybe he could explain, but yeah.
I mean, that's a very deep, age-old question that I don't think, I'm certainly not prepared to answer. I think,
Does the documentary answer it over the 18 hours?
Well, I think we show that this episode is called Deja Vu, the first episode, and that is the French experience, right, in how they lost. And you see many things that happen to them that are going to happen to us.
if you're a very close viewer or you know a lot about the war, by the end of the first episode, you will be addressing exactly your question.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think we leave it for the audience to decide why we couldn't take the lessons that they learned, hard lessons.
Okay, that's it. I think we have to.
Got time
All right, one more.
got time for one more. Thanks for coming to Detroit.
Thank you.
Most documentary films about Vietnam and otherwise seem to over-rely on Time Life Films and CBS News Network. You guys seem to be pros at finding the personal, the diary, the letter, the photograph, the personal, and then taking the personal and making it universal. How do you find those things? And I hope you're modestly flattered to learn that 10 seconds into that Ozark family audio tape, I was thinking, man, that's the Sullivan-Ballou letter from Civil War. And that's what resonated for me. That was like, wow, they found it. How do you find those things?
I think everyone is some ways a happy accident, or just we really follow up on almost every lead that comes to us. So Ken and Lynn were in St. Louis or Minneapolis. St. Louis, I think, promoting the 10th inning, and they were running around doing a version of what we're doing here tonight, and they both called me and said,
Well, someone asked what our next project was, and we
Right.
said Vietnam. So someone came up to us.
yes.
Yeah.
And then I was in New York, and there's a family, and they have these audio tapes, and we said send them, and we got them transferred, and we listened to them, and they're unusual for a number of reasons, and they're in the film.
And I must say, from a Time Life documentary film, compared to what these people do, it's very important, I think, to understand that difference. Spending 10 years and being very deliberative and very smart and asking a lot of questions of yourself, a lot of questions of the people that you engage to give you perspective, but trying so earnestly to tell a clear, honest story that reflects so many contradictory and difficult points of view. I think that is the gift of what Florentine Films does with their work. I think we are in for a spectacular experience as we sit in front of our televisions for those 10 episodes for the 18 hours. I believe there's probably as many questions as there are answers.
If not more.
And I think that's the nature of this particular conflict, this particular episode, this particular chapter of American history. Unfortunately, we have to cut off this discussion. I'm imagining you might stay around in the lobby for a minute or two.
We actually have to catch very early flights tomorry morning.
I heard a 4
4:45.
o'clock
We have a
flight.
4 o'clock
I'm so
call, so-
sorry. Ordinarily, we
Yes.
would, but I
one
think
more?
we actually... Yes, okay, go ahead. Make it very quick, though, or they're going
Okay.
to...
We're going to take one more question.
1972, in winter of Detroit, 1972. I don't know if you're familiar with it. There was in Detroit called the Winter Soldier Investigation.
Yes, we are familiar with that.
Jane Fonda, Donald Sutherland came to Detroit. He wanted to get the soldiers' point of view of fighting in Vietnam. There were soldiers who came forth, veterans, the regular grunt guy who gave testimony here in Detroit. Do you know of that?
We do.
We do.
Okay, I guess you answered my question.
Yes.
You have to watch the
You
film.
watch the movie.
Because I think there are people here who were people
Oh,
who
wow.
documented it.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you for
Great.
sharing.
Thank
Let
you.
know.
Well,
Ladies and
yeah, thank you.
Please.
I would just say I think the story of veterans coming home or active duty and criticizing the war and protesting against it is an extremely important part of our story.
Yes.
Ladies and gentlemen,
Thank
let's
you.
show our appreciation to Lynn Novick, Sarah Botstein, and Florentine Films for this outstanding preview. Do we all promise to tune in to WTVS this September? Great. Thank you. Thank you for coming to Cinetopia, and we'll see you at the next film.